All right, we'd like to go ahead and talk a little bit about the very first president of the United States and the very first administration, that of George Washington. So we just go ahead, we pass the Constitution, we ratify that, and now we have to go about the business of actually implementing a government. And that was really George Washington's job, and that's really what his first administration was all about. One of the very first things that the government does under Washington is they go ahead and they passed the Bill of Rights, and those are the first 10 amendments to our Constitution. There were actually originally 12 of them, and when the states ratified the Constitution, it was with the understanding that these amendments would be immediately taken up and discussed once the new government came into force. 10 of the amendments were originally approved. They're the traditional Bill of Rights. 2 were denied, one of which ended up coming back way about 200 years later. The 27th Amendment to the Constitution is one that deals with congressional salaries and was actually one of the first 12 that were proposed. It's not really considered part of the Bill of Rights, but it was one of those original 12 amendments that were originally proposed during the Washington administration, but was not in fact ratified until 1992. The basic idea behind the Bill of Rights was that it was supposed to protect individuals from government interference. It limits the government, and that's the purpose of those first 10 amendments. From there, the government goes about setting up the necessary parts of the government that aren't specifically addressed in the Constitution. For instance, the Congress passes the Judiciary Act of 1789. It provides for 6 Supreme Court justices, 5 associates, and 1 Chief Justice. Originally, now today we have 9, so laws have been changed to add to that, but originally it was just 6 justices. It establishes also the rest of the judiciary branch. Congress, under the Judiciary Act of 1789, establishes 16 federal courts, 3 appeals courts, and originally 13 district courts. Again, today we have more than that, and so Congress has changed and grown the judiciary through legislative action. But originally 3 appeals courts with only 13 district courts. They also go ahead, Congress does, and establishes the Office of the Attorney General, as well as the U.S. Marshal Service. None of these things are really provided for by the Constitution, but they are deemed to be things that are both necessary and proper for the governing of the country. So unintentionally, Congress is really beginning to form what will become the president's cabinet. In other words, all of the people who helped him to govern the country and to execute or to carry out the laws of the United States. Other departments that are established by Congress include the Secretary of State. Washington appoints the first Secretary of State. Thomas Jefferson becomes our first Secretary of State. They establish the Secretary of War. We no longer call this position the Secretary of War. He's now called the Secretary of Defense, or in charge of the Department of Defense. Congress also goes ahead and establishes the Secretary of the Treasury. The first Secretary of the Treasury is a guy by the name of Alexander Hamilton, incredibly influential on our nation's monetary and financial system. And a lot of the country's early economic policies were actually really developed by Alexander Hamilton. He puts a huge emphasis on paying off foreign debts. He believes that a key to providing a thriving country and establishing a strong federal government is paying our debts, establishing good credit. He does a couple things in order to do this. One of the things he does is he has the national government assume the debts of the states. The states, a lot of them owed money as a result of the American Revolution, and we're still struggling to pay those off. So he says, you know what, to make sure that our name is good, to make sure that people are willing to loan us money, the federal government's going to step in and help those states pay off their debts. This really favors the northern states. The northern states had gone more heavily into debt as a result of the American Revolution, and the northern states were struggling to pay off these debts. The southern states, which didn't have as much debt from the American Revolution, because again, most of the revolution occurs in the north, the southern states had already paid off their debt, so they didn't want to do this. They're like, look, we pay off our debt, then the northern states can't pay theirs off, and so now we're going to have to help pay theirs off too. They didn't feel this was right, and so this was a disagreement right away between the South and the North. So already you start to see some divisions between those two regions in our country. Alexander Hamilton further goes on and says, okay, well, how are we going to pay this off? He goes, it's not all going to be necessarily from taxing the South. One of the things he says is we're going to issue bonds. In other words, the government's going to take on new debt in order to pay off their old debt. So by issuing these bonds, with the money they make from issuing the bonds, which a bond is just a promise to pay you back later, so basically new debt, we're going to go ahead and take that money that we get from the bonds and we're going to pay off all these old debts. Further, Hamilton said, not only are we going to do that, but we're also going to go ahead and we're going to start charging tariffs, a tax on imported goods. So when somebody wants to bring something into our country, we're going to charge them a tax called a tariff. and we're going to take some of that money and we're going to pay off our old debt. But probably the most controversial thing Alexander Hamilton did was he proposed an excise tax, which is more or less just a sales tax. And what he was going to tax was whiskey. This really affected your Western farmers, and it leads directly to the Whiskey Rebellion. So one of the very first, right out of the gates, I mean, our Constitution, 1789, within Washington's administration, they're already rebelling against the power of the federal government. The farmers out in Western Pennsylvania in particular refused to pay the tax. And Alexander Hamilton himself, the Secretary of the Treasury, leads an army to Western Pennsylvania and puts down the Whiskey Rebellion and basically tells them, no, you are going to pay the tax. And this really establishes the authority of our federal government. We had corrected the problems of the Articles of Confederation. The new government had the authority, had the capability of enforcing its laws, whereas the government under the Articles of Confederation did not. Another one of the things Hamilton really argues for is the establishment of a national bank. Hamilton argues, look, this is constitutional because it's necessary and proper to carry out the powers given to Congress. In other words, Congress has the power to tax, Congress has the power to borrow money. We need some type of entity, some type of organization which monitors and controls all that, and that's the role of the federal bank. The federal bank also was needed to provide for stable currency. And again, another power given to the federal government, the power to coin money. In order to go ahead and control our currency, we need somebody kind of in charge, and the bank can do that. So the bank was basically needed, if you wanted to sum it up, to handle the nation's money, to monitor money coming in, that's taxes, and to control the money going out. We needed somebody to write the checks that we would go ahead and send to other people, so to speak. The other advantage Hamilton argues for is that if there's a national bank, it's going to have to be funded, and it's going to be funded by the wealthy people in America, in the United States. And so they would have a vested interest in seeing that the government succeeded. And if the wealthy are on board, Hamilton reasoned, the government was going to be more secure, more stable, because they're going to go ahead and want to see the government succeed. And so Hamilton argues for a national bank. On the other side, there were some pretty powerful arguments against, and they were made really by Jefferson and Madison. They argued that, look, this national bank favors the northern businesses over the southern farmers. In other words, you're going to have wealthy businesses that are going to have an influence over our government that the southern farmers wouldn't. They basically are foreshadowing some of the big complaints about our government today, that the wealthy businesses have a powerful lobby in Washington. They can get Washington to do what they want. That goes right back to some of the concerns that Jefferson and Madison had about establishing a national bank. But more than that, they said, look, there's no provision in the Constitution for a government to establish a national bank. It's unconstitutional. It wasn't one of the powers expressly granted to our federal government. What you see, this disagreement, is really the birth of the two-party system. The Federalists, who favor a strong federal government, are Hamilton, a bigger government, a stronger government. The Republicans, who favor a weaker federal government and a stronger state government or a stronger republic, they go ahead and they follow Jefferson. They're initially called Anti-Federalists, but eventually will change their name to the Democratic Republicans, and eventually drop the Republican altogether. And the Jeffersonian Party is really the forerunner of the modern Democratic Party, although they don't necessarily see eye to eye on a lot of the issues. The modern Democrats wouldn't agree with the Republicans of Jefferson's time on a whole host of issues about the size of government and the power of government. But this is really the birth of our two-party system that we still have today.